Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and for the question. I think there's an assumption in the question that we're talking about conglomerate mergers. So I'd probably start by just explaining what a conglomerate merger is. The simplest definition of a conglomerate merger is really just one that isn't strictly horizontal or vertical. From the ACCC guidelines, that's the authority for which I work. These are mergers that involve firms that interact across several separate markets and supply products that are typically in some way related to each other. So, for example, products that are in neighbouring markets or products that are complementary in either demand or supply, such as staples and staplers. And in thinking about how we should conceptualize the harm of these, in light of the lack of existing or potential direct relationships between the parties of a conglomerate merger, the ability of these sort of transactions to cause competitive harm is controversial. So Jonas touched on foreclosure as an issue, and I'd like to look at the differences between conglomerate merger theories of harm and foreclosure. So the predominant theory of how a conglomerate merger will result in anti-competitive effects is known as market leverage theory of harm. This suggests that a conglomerate merger may enable a firm with market power in one market to leverage that market power into an adjacent market, usually through tying and bundling. As will be apparent, there's a couple of elements to this. The first is that the firm must have market power in the first product market. So it must have a must-have product. And in the second market, customers are forced to buy an item in order to access the must-have product in the first market through bundling and tying. So unlike foreclosure, the focus of these theories of harm isn't access to inputs or access to a market. Rather, it's the dynamic impact on the markets of strategic behaviour. The question also asked what the challenges antitrust authorities face when analysing merger cases involving conglomerate power. And in broad terms, where the merger parties aren't competitors or aren't customers of one another, it can be hard to identify and prove the harm. So the critical question becomes, what is the harm and where does it occur? And to answer that, most authorities adopt an ability incentive effect framework. First, will the firm have the ability to engage in strategic bundling or tying behaviour? And whether a firm will have that ability will depend on the degree of market power that they have in the primary market, the complementarity of demand, economies of scale and scope, and whether rivals have the ability to defeat the bundle. The second question is whether the firms have an incentive to engage in that sort of behaviour. And this is usually an inquiry about the profitability of that strategy if the firm was to choose to undertake it. And here there's a really fascinating long-running divergence between the various authorities. So in Australia in 2003, I know that's going back a while, Australia actually opposed a transaction which was Coca-Cola Amador Berry, which I'll go into in some detail a little bit later. But in the States, there's a long-standing Chicago school criticism which suggests that profitable bundling or tying between markets isn't possible in certain circumstances, so that there would be no incentive for firms to undertake this conduct. And that view is losing traction a little bit. And the incentive to bundle and tie for strategic reasons is becoming increasingly accepted in dynamic markets and where neither market is perfectly competitive. So what's often difficult for authorities is that bundling and tying can occur both for strategic reasons, but also for efficiency enhancing reasons. And the competitive outcome may vary depending on the reason for which it's undertaken. So very quickly, some efficient reasons for bundling and tying might be as a means to improve pricing decisions, to prevent double marginalisation, to improve efficiencies in production, or to achieve efficiencies in consumption. But strategic reasons might include intentional anti-competitive foreclosure in a dynamic market, to prevent competitors obtaining scale and efficiencies in production, or to force competition bundle against bundle. So finally, where the ability and incentive have been established, regulators are then required to ask what the effect is of that behaviour. And it's a highly fact-specific inquiry throughout the application of the ability incentive effect assessment. And that's what makes conglomerate mergers such a challenge for antitrust authorities. No presumptions can be made, and the outcome can be either welfare enhancing or harmful, depending on the specific merger and the conduct. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Mandy. Now, Melissa, the approach to non-horizontal theories of harm can vary greatly among different competition authorities around the world. Would you please describe how those divergences affect competition analysis?
Thanks, Daniela. It's great to be here. It's morning where I am, so good morning or good day to everyone. In terms of the question kind of suggests that there are considerable divergences. And in 2018, the ICN published the results of its vertical mergers survey. And the survey actually found that there was a pretty consistent approach by competition agencies to the assessment of vertical mergers in terms of the input and customer foreclosure that Jonas talked about, and then also in terms of the application of an ability, incentive, and effects framework. So it at least appears from the survey results that agencies are looking at it from the same framework. That said, I think the application of that framework may result in divergent outcomes. The other thing I just thought I'd note that came out of the survey, in addition to the foreclosure theories, the other theory that was found to be common, but certainly less common than foreclosure theories, related to information sharing. So the harm to competition as a result of the merged entity having access to competitively sensitive information of its rivals. And you'll see there's a bit of that, there's a number of cases on that. And then I think later on, we're going to talk about some of the more modern theories of harm, but in particular relating to digital markets, where we've got some harm to innovation and privacy and the like. So I think we'll talk about that a bit later on. So getting back to the fact that agencies may be considering similar input and customer foreclosure, we're using the same ability, incentive, and effects framework. The application of that may result in, as I said, in different outcomes. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that we each have our own unique legal framework. We each have our own processes, and we've each got our own priorities. And that may be why we're seeing some of those differences. Another, I think one of the sort of larger debates that is going on right now, particularly in the US, relates to the presumption that vertical mergers are largely pro-competitive. There's sort of a growing body of thought that perhaps the empirical evidence doesn't support that line of thinking, and in addition to that, some skepticism about the efficiencies that merging parties may be claiming in the context of a vertical merger. And a lot of that discussion is focused on the elimination of double marginalization, and whether we've relied on it too heavily as a pro-competitive measure of the transaction. So the elimination of double marginalization, this is the effect from reducing one of the firms in the supply chain that needs to make a profit. So when there's incentives for the firm to act as an integrated business, this can bring downward pricing prices by cutting internal costs. So the elimination of double marginalization isn't always relevant to the analysis. You've got to look at the particular characteristics of the market. In particular, there had to have been a markup pre-merger. The parties had to have been marking up their prices, so they had to be earning a margin pre-merger. So, for example, in a situation where, for example, a platform where there's no price, the elimination of double marginalization isn't likely going to be a consideration. The other thing to take into account when you're thinking about the elimination of double marginalization is whether it could be achieved some other way, for example, through a contract, as opposed to the merger. And then the third thing to think about is whether there's an effect on the downstream price to the consumer. Will it actually be passed through at the end of the day? And then just going back to the ICN survey, determining the pro-competitive effects of the elimination of double marginalization and whether they're going to offset the competitive harm is a quantitative exercise and very fact dependent and very complex. And the survey actually found that while some agencies did indicate they were using sort of vertical arithmetic or vertical gross upward pricing pressure indices or VGUPPs, a substantial proportion of the respondents said that they never use them. And I think since the survey was done, the CMA has removed the references to these from their guidelines. The Americans have withdrawn their vertical merger guidelines. So it certainly seems that there's a trend to rethinking these issues. So certainly something to be thinking about when you're doing your analysis. And there's a couple of, we're sort of short on time, so maybe I'll just mention them. There's a couple of decisions where, authorities have applied the similar framework, but come out with different results. One is the Meta and customer merger. The results from the EC and from the CMA are different. With respect to, in particular, their findings around the incentive to foreclose. And then I think if we've got time, Jonas is going to talk about the aluminum Grail transaction, where the merger has ended up in a slightly different place in the US than it has in the EC. So if we've got some time, maybe we'll be able to talk about that in a bit more detail.
Thanks for bringing your considerations on the topic, Melissa. In conclusion, non-horizontal theories of harm play a crucial role in antitrust analysis. They allow for a deeper understanding of the anti-competitive effects that certain business practices and mergers can have on competition. In particular, foreclosure and conglomerate power are two classic examples that have been extensively studied and applied in competition analysis. Antitrust authorities face different challenges when analyzing merger cases involving theories of harm, such as assessing market power, adopting an ability incentive effect model, and balancing efficiencies. Moreover, divergences in the approach or the outcome among different competition authorities can sometimes create uncertainty for global businesses and complicate international cooperation, especially when assessing international cases. Now let's move to our next topic, modern non-horizontal theories of harm. As the business environment evolves and antitrust analysis become increasingly in-depth, we have faced new or not so new theories of harm associated with non-horizontal mergers. Now let's hear from Melissa. Well, additionally to the classic theories of harm, modern theories are being discussed in academic articles and in competition authorities analysis, many of which relate to digital markets. Please discuss the theories associated with non-monetary price increases, meaning excessive data collection, for example, and also reduction in quality, also meaning excessive data collection or violation of users' privacy.
Thanks, Danielle. So in terms of theories of harm related to excessive data collection, so in digital markets where firms are relying on data to improve or personalize their products or services, we can think of the provision of personal data as the price. I put that in quotes, the price, or one of the prices that are paid by users for the service. So in a vertical merger, a supplier may gain access to its rivals' third-party data, including data on users' interests, users' behavior, trends relating to the use of the rival's products or services. And access to this data could make the merged entity more competitive, in the sense that it can use the data to provide an improved product or service. On the other hand, where rivals don't have access to similar data, so we've got an inconsistent access to data, it can make it more difficult for the rival to compete or for potential rivals to enter or expand. So essentially raising barriers to entry or expansion. So partial input foreclosure may occur where rivals are required to continue to supply data or to not hide data that was being provided pre-merger as a condition of ongoing supply. Similarly, rivals could also be required to provide more data than they were providing pre-merger as a condition of ongoing supply. So here, maybe I'll talk a bit about the meta and the meta customer merger, because these are sort of issues that were on the table there. So that transaction was considered by both the EC and the CMA, and they considered whether there would be harm as a result of Meta's access to increased data through customer, and both agencies ultimately rejected the theory of harm. But in particular, they investigated what data Meta would obtain from customers. And just for those of you that don't know, Customer is a provider of customer management services. And it was a fairly small entity at the time of the acquisition, but a fairly innovative entity. And it primarily offered business-to-business products, and it didn't own the data of its customers. So in order for Meta to get access to the data, it would have had to, customer would have had to have agreements with the business customer. So they would have needed to get consent from the end customer. So in the end, the analysis, because customer was a relatively small firm, the fact that it was expected to grow was taken into consideration, but the amount of additional data relative to the data that Meta already had wasn't considered to be significant. And on top of that, the rival providers of display advertising services also had similar access to commercial data. Because of the businesses interested in sharing data in order to target their ads or better target their advertising. So in both reviews, the agencies determined that the additional data that Meta was potentially going to gain access to for the purpose of improving its online display advertising wasn't going to result in a negative impact on competition between providers of online display advertising services. The second more modern theory of harm relates to the violation or the potential violation of users' privacies. So this again is another non-price effect. And so to the extent that consumers value privacy, and firms compete with respect to the privacy safeguards or transparency in respect of how their data may be used, we can consider it as an element of product quality. And privacy quality reductions as a result of a merger might include, for example, a degradation in the level of privacy protection afforded. So this was the issue in the Microsoft LinkedIn case. which I can talk a little bit more about in a minute. Or you may see it in the sense of an increase in personal data processing. So what's actually done with the user's data? Is it recorded? Is it restructured? How is it being used differently? And it could also result in an increase in the amount of behavioral advertising that a user is receiving with no offsetting benefit. So in the Microsoft LinkedIn transaction, this was reviewed by the EC, and it looked at whether customer foreclosure, whether the acquisition would result in customer foreclosure, and found ultimately the transaction was likely to reduce consumer privacy options for users of professional social networking services, and that's how LinkedIn services were defined. So post-transaction, it was determined that Microsoft would have the incentive and the ability to use its strong market position to exclude competing providers of professional social networking services with likely detrimental effects on the privacy options available to consumers. And there were two ways that the EC thought this might happen. The first was Microsoft's ability to integrate LinkedIn features directly into Microsoft's Office software and deny rival social networking services similar access. And the second way was Microsoft could require that PC manufacturers pre-install LinkedIn as the default social networking service on PCs running Windows. And the commission found that such conduct was likely to marginalize rival professional service networks from competition. So since some of these competing social networks offered greater privacy protection than LinkedIn, the commission found that the merger was likely to reduce consumer privacy options in the relevant market, and in response, impose various obligations on the parties as a condition of approval. So those are two examples of more recent theories of harm relating to the collection and privacy of data.
Thank you, Melissa. Turning to the next question, Jonas, the topic of self-preferencing has gained attention in the antitrust field, especially with debates also related to digital markets, although it does not seem to be a practice restricted to these markets. See the retail sector, for example. Explain the theories of harm associated with this practice and how it applies to competition analysis.
There's the unmute button too, right? So thanks for that question, Danielle. I think I need some help to answer that. Maybe this crystal ball will help us since we are doing forward-looking analysis here today. Let's see where we go from here. I don't know. Self-preferencing. I mean, it's a term that we have seen used quite a lot, both in merger analysis, but also in unilateral conduct. But when we really think about it in the merger context, is it that different from what we've been talking about before? Basically, the issues that we've covered in several of the other questions here have been whether, a vertically integrated, new entity or someone who buys someone on an adjacent market, if we say that there is a self-preferencing concern, do we mean something that is fundamentally different from whether there is a foreclosure risk or whether there are conglomerate concerns? I'm not sure. I mean, just think back to these stylized examples I mentioned here earlier today. We talked about, acquiring ferry operator that gives preference to its own service business. That's a form of self-preferencing you can think about. Question is it anti-competitive? It's a different, that's part of the analysis, but conceptually. And the pharma company that favors its API business, the active ingredient, and its newly acquired downstream, marketing business. the airline that favors its business and how it lists rivals or changes commissions for the rivals listings. I mean, these are, you know, these are traditional older economy type settings, but it's there is a self-preference in question there. So I don't know if there's a need for us to reinvent the wheel in terms of how we analyze this, but maybe, you know, the first key question is, you know, how do we apply this, the theory of harm? How does it fit into the newer industrial context? I mean, that's a crucial thing to do in a first step. And you know, we've talked about some case examples here earlier today, and you know, one of these examples that come up from time to time is the Google Fitbit deal and the European Commission's analysis there, where you know, one line of analysis was whether the acquirer would sort of degrade or restrict rivals' access to the target's web API, and what would the effect be on startups? You know, would there be a form of input foreclosure for your own benefit? Or, you know, the acquirer, you know, could they leverage the position in mobile operating systems into the wrist-worn wearables and degrade operating system APIs for third-party providers? In a way, that's sort of a tying type issue that you can think about it as. But you know, you could also say that this is a form of self-preferencing. Now, the second key question from my point of view has to do with evidence, you know, burden and standard of proof, and how do, you know, when you look into the evidence in a particular case, is there a close match between the theory applied in the industrial context and the evidence that one has? You know, how close a match between the theory and the available evidence can we establish? And that's, I think, particularly important when we are doing these analyses in digital markets or in industries that are evolving very quickly. So, I mean, that's a few thoughts on that topic.
Thank you so much, Jonas. Now, Mandy, based on econometric studies, the specialized literature has argued that the relationship between competition and innovation takes the form of an inverted U. Both lack of competition and excessive competition can stifle innovation. Explain how the theories related to reduction in choice and deleterious effects on innovation apply to competition analysis.
Thank you very much for the question. And you might have to bear with me a little bit speaking about econometric studies in the specialized literature just after midnight, but we'll see how we go. So it might be worth at the first instance just delving into what is meant by that inverted U relationship between competition and innovation. What the theory suggests is that a market with a monopolist will not really innovate, and innovation will increase as competition increases until a point, and then it will decrease again as the market moves to being perfectly competitive. And in terms of innovation, this has some intuitive appeal because much of the theory that this is derived from focuses on the incentives to innovate and who's capable of capturing the benefit of that innovation. So that inverted U theory suggests that monopolists have no need to innovate, and there's no benefit to them of investing in R&D because they've already got the entire market, unless it's productive innovation that would lower their own production costs and would not be required to pass on to consumers. Similarly, in highly competitive markets, it's also unlikely to give rise to innovation because each individual competitor sees a smaller proportion of the benefits from any innovation, action, or expenditure. So accordingly, the inverted U hypothesis suggests that moderately competitive markets innovate the most, with both monopoly and highly competitive markets showing weaker innovation. And the implication of this is that no presumption can be made about the effect of any particular transaction on innovation. The effect would depend on the competitiveness of the market that the merger or the transaction occurs in, and whether or not it's a tight oligopoly. So the second part of the question asked about how the theories related to reduction in choice and deleterious effect on innovation apply within the context of a competition analysis. And I think it's important to highlight that competition is not an end in and of itself. Competition between firms that supply goods and services is desirable, as it's usually the best way to enhance consumer welfare by promoting economic efficiency. But insofar as innovation results in improved consumer welfare, then it is also a factor that is properly to be considered in competition analysis. And the implications of a transaction on innovation may have a greater impact than price effects in terms of consumer welfare. Now, price is only one outcome in a competitive market, and it's often a focus of static competitive assessment. But firms can compete on price, they can compete on service, they can compete on innovation and other aspects of quality. And increasingly dynamic competitive analysis is focusing on these non-price effects, as Melissa went into a little bit there. And these can be harder for a regulator to prove and quantify, as there's less settled economic theory about the likely effects of any particular transaction. And I'll discuss this in the context of innovation specifically in a moment. In spite of these difficulties, the ACCC has publicly submitted to the OECD that quality in terms of service and innovation, etc., should be a goal of competitive analysis, as it can be welfare enhancing, and that the assessment of non-price effects of a transaction should be part of the competitive assessment of merger matters. So luckily in Australia, we operate under an informal merger regime, which is flexible enough to allow us to analyse the competitive effects, including the likely effects on innovation over time. But in practice, when you're looking at the innovative effects of a merger or any particular transaction, it can be difficult to factor into the competitive assessment. There are no presumptions, as the inverted U implies. Can't just assume that because there's a decrease in the number of competitors, it will lead to a decrease in innovation. And in some circumstances, a reduction in competitive intensity would allow firms to increase the proportion of their R&D spend that they can recoup. So how we deal with this is we just take a very fact-driven case-by-case approach. And broadly, an assessment that considers the likely impact of a transaction on innovation would consider a range of things. So the number of participants in the market, the competitive intensity of that market, the type of innovation that's being undertaken. So whether it's process innovation or it's innovation for a prize for the market, the ability of firms to free ride on the innovation of others, and the character of the participants involved, whether they're the type of participant that tends to innovate or tends to lag. And the approach taken by any authority might also be regulated by the legislative context in which they're working. But irrespective of the analytical approach taken, given the potential for innovation to have significant welfare effects, it is properly to be considered part of their competitive assessment, even if it's difficult to predict. But winning cases on the basis of innovation theories of harm might be a bit harder. It's also just one last closing comment, sorry, very conscious of time. It's also important to bear in mind that innovation is a non-price effect, and any positive or detrimental effect will still need to be balanced against the price effects of the transaction in an overall competitive assessment. I might leave it there. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Mandy. Well, modern theories of harm have become increasingly relevant in antitrust analysis, especially in the context of digital markets. Excessive data collection in particular can be understood as non-monetary price increases and violate users' privacy. Self-preferencing refers to giving preferential treatment to its own products or services over those of rivals, but evaluating the harm is not straightforward. These practices can have significant implications for competition analysis as they can limit consumer choice, reduce innovation, and harm competition. Moreover, the relationship between competition and innovation is complex. Therefore, antitrust authorities need to carefully consider the potential deleterious effects of both lack of competition and excessive competition on innovation and take appropriate measures to promote and protect competition in markets. In this sense, in Brazil, CADE has published a couple years ago a document in which it reviewed several specialized reports concerning new tools and procedures to tackle digital markets, including theories of harm, of course. Although no official changes to its merger guidelines were made yet, it's been informally incorporated to the analytical method adopted by CADE to fit case by case. Now let's go to our last topic and discuss a few case studies. We've had the opportunity to discuss the main theories of harm associated with non-horizontal mergers, and it will be very interesting to see how those theories have been applied to concrete cases. For this purpose, our panelists will present a few case studies in which antitrust authorities around the world have faced those theories. Let's hear from Mandy now. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering whether I should still go through all of my case studies given the time, or whether I should just pick one. I might just start with one if that's okay and see where we get to. So perhaps I'll have a quick look at Google Fitbit. So in terms of the facts of the case, the acquirer is Google. It probably doesn't need a whole lot of introduction because it's Google, but yeah, I will give a brief overview of their activities. So relevantly, Google's a significant supplier of consumer and business-facing technology services, and it's got a substantial presence in multiple technology markets. And it's been successful in offering services on a range of personal computers and tablets and smartphones. It also maintains and develops the Android ecosystem, which includes an open source mobile operating system. That's relevant because that was something that the target relied on. And it develops a licensable operating system for smart watches and health apps. Because of its operations, Google was allowed to collect large volumes of high-quality data and offer targeted advertising services. And Google's accumulation of data and from a variety of sources has provided it with important economies of scope and contributes to its market power in a range of markets. Relevant for the specific transaction, though, it wasn't actually active in fitness wearables. The target, Fitbit, developed, manufactured and distributed wrist-worn wearable devices, as well as some smart scales, software and services. To complement its devices, it also developed a mobile app, and the app's functionality relied on Google inputs, and it allowed users to sync their devices to their phone and view metrics. And it also collected some quite sensitive health data from the Fitbit devices. So in Australia, we considered a number of theories of harm. We considered the aggregation of data as an essential input and whether that raised barriers to entry. We considered a quite standard vertical foreclosure theory of harm and whether there was an incentive post-acquisition to foreclose competing wearable manufacturers because Google controlled some of the inputs, and a number of other theories of harm that we didn't think were likely to raise concern. And the EU, an even broader number of markets and theories of harm were considered. But I'll just quickly come to a couple of aspects of why I think this matter is so interesting. The first is that this was a non-horizontal acquisition that could raise serious concerns worldwide and with a number of regulators, and it's relatively novel that vertical mergers and non-horizontal mergers are being taken so seriously worldwide. And much like didn't actually speak about it, but the Amazon MGM transaction, a level of discomfort existed among regulators in the growth of an already dominant firm into other markets. And some commentators at the time suggested that the use of traditional market analysis and tools, and most regulators did use traditional tools and traditional theories of harm, was a missed opportunity, and that the matter could have been considered in terms of ecosystem theories of harm rather than considering effects in individual markets. The second reason I think this is an interesting case is because of its issues around data as an essential input, and particularly sensitive health data. Privacy advocates at the time raised issues with the acquisition, which were really difficult for antitrust regulators to grapple with and incorporate into their analysis in the traditional frameworks. And the last reason I think this is just such a fascinating case is the strategic behaviour by the applicants in the order in which regulators were approached, and the divergence in approach of the various regulators. So this transaction was notified relevantly in the EU, in the US, and with Australia, and the outcomes were different in each jurisdiction. So the EU, who I understand was notified first, also adopted, like Australia, a market-by-market approach and didn't consider ecosystem competition. It ultimately approved the transaction subject to behavioural commitments to encourage innovation, protect data use. So sensitive data could not be incorporated into the provision of targeted advertising services, general protections about sensitive data, and a retention of interoperability. So the transaction then closed after the parties closed the transaction, after the EU approval was received and after the DOJ waiting period was finalised, but prior to the completion of the DOJ investigation. And just from an Australian perspective, the Australian authority was asked to consider the European remedies, and those are not types of remedies we'd ordinarily consider. And in spite of our ongoing investigation, the transaction was closed and the review was never ultimately completed. So I find that an interesting case for a number of reasons. But given the time, I might see if any of the other panelists want to speak to their cases before I move on to another one.
Okay, I agree. It's an interesting case. Thank you, Mandy. Moving to our next panelist, now we have Jonas. Please go ahead and tell us about a few more cases.
I could go on all afternoon or evening or morning or night, but let me just do 3 quick hits, and I'll tell you why I think they should be of interest for this audience. So the first is a European Commission decision from 2018, and it is the Essilor-Luxottica decision. It's a phase 2 clearance decision, but I think it's interesting for a number of reasons. So this is a deal that brings together, and looking at my fellow panelists here, Melissa and Mandy, and we all 3 of us, we wear spectacles, and that's what that deal is about. It's about a very successful company, Luxottica, that is strong, particularly in frames of spectacles and in sunglasses, and that's being acquired by someone who is a very strong player in lenses. So, and these are, of course, medical devices. They're, in some countries, there's particular regulation around this, and they're sold in many different places in Europe. So when 2 companies now come together and become the biggest player in the industry, you can expect that, there will be many views on that. And it's one of the cases where there were many people who expressed critical views. And I think the commission, had 4,000 respondents or thereabout to market test questionnaires, which is extraordinary. But at the end of the day, didn't find a serious substantive concern, but had the opportunity to go through potential theories of harm, both of a vertical conglomerate and to some extent also horizontal nature in some respects. So this decision, which is long and an interesting read if you have some time, it provides a roadmap to a number of steps and a number of types of analyses that can be useful to undertake in cases like this. So that's why, in a way, it's a textbook type decision that one can read for that reason, if no other. So the second case that I thought maybe say a few words about, and that's it's a CMA case from 2018, which was a case where the CMA adopted provisional findings, and then the parties aborted the deal. So that's where the story ends from a practical perspective. But this is the Thermo Fisher or Gatan acquisition, which concerned various microscopes and cameras and other things that are used in diagnostic and medical procedures. So why should we be interested in reading something like that? Well, we've among the different theories of harm that the CMA considered, I think it's instructive because they did look at reduced interoperability as a potential theory of harm, reducing maintenance and service availability for rivals products, delaying supply or delay in innovation were also things that they looked at, as well as incorporating input into emerging party product while allowing other rivals products to lag, and prioritizing R&D spend on the merging parties downstream product over those of an input. So these are different types of theories of harm than what we've talked about here today, of a more technical nature in many respects. So it can be an interesting case to look at for that reason. So the third case, and Melissa, you mentioned this already, the Illumina Grail is of course an ongoing situation. There is a lot about that that's not public, and I've looked at this from what we can see from the US and from the EC procedures. There's a court procedure going on in Luxembourg with respect to the EC prohibition. It's a recent case. But so there are some aspects here which I find particularly noteworthy. So this is about a target that is developing cancer testing test, a very advanced cancer testing test, and it is someone that has equipment that acquires this company that can utilize tests like that. So because at the downstream level, there is no product really out there, but there are a number of players who are developing these products. And there's the expectation that it will take maybe up to 10 to 12 years to know what will be the outcome of that innovation race that's going on at that level. And then this transaction happens, and the concern is that the acquirer will have both the ability and incentive to put that innovation race out of out of play, so to speak, by foreclosing rivals. So there is and over that period of time, again 10 to 12 years, we will know what the outcome is. But clearly, the European Commission felt that there was enough evidence to support a prohibition. And in the United States, I understand that the FTC would have wanted to come to a similar position, but an administrative law judge there has published a long opinion, which also is an interesting read, I think, on why that case didn't add up. So what comes to mind for me here is time. When we think about non-horizontal theories of harm, there is a time component. We are looking at a deal at a particular point in time, and the analysis is over a potentially long period of time will harm emerge. And it takes us back to this question about finding a tight match between the theory and the available evidence that must rise to the to the relevant level. And just a few words maybe that I will stop there. There is by now an old case from Luxembourg which deals with conglomerate mergers and with the question of evaluation of evidence, where the court said that there's first a consideration of a lengthy period of time in the future, and second, the leveraging that gives rise to a significant impediment of effective competition means that the chains of cause and effect are dimly discernible. And for that reason, it's particularly important to have strong evidence. So if I look into the crystal ball with that, I can see that on this assessment in Luxembourg of the case we just talked about, that's probably going to be one of the questions in debate.
Thank you. Those are very interesting merger cases, Jonas. Now, Melissa, you have the floor.
Thanks, Danielle. So I'm going to start with the Tesco Booker merger, which is a CMA review from 2017. And I think it's interesting. It's a textbook type of diversion analysis, and it's very well written. So it's a good resource. It's a good decision to look at for your sort of textbook diversion type analysis. So Tesco is a grocery retailer, and it was buying Booker, which is a grocery wholesaler. And the CMA's analysis involved overlaps that related to more than 12,000 stores that were supplied by Booker. So that's a lot of local areas to have to take into consideration. That's a lot of work. But the two main theories of harm that the CMA was looking at was whether post-merger Tesco would have an incentive to raise its retail prices, taking into account that some of the sales that were lost by Tesco would divert to retailers that were supplied by Booker, meaning that at least some of the margin would be recaptured as a result. They also had to take into consideration, though, that some of the retailers that were supplied by Booker also used other wholesalers, and that some retailers were not supplied by Booker at all. And then the second theory of harm related to whether Booker's post-merger incentive to raise wholesale prices and whether that might induce Booker's downstream retailers to also increase their price, resulting in Tesco winning some additional customers or additional profits. What's interesting there is that Booker didn't control the retail price of its customers. The CMA considered a really broad range of evidence in doing its analysis. So they had survey responses from nearly 5,000 retailers. They had internal documents and data from the merging parties. They had views from wholesalers, retailers, and other third parties. They collected data on wholesale churn rates, wholesaler depot locations, and competitors' catchment areas in their geographic market analysis. They also did an econometric analysis of the impact of entry and exit by competing retailers on Booker's sales. And they also did, and I think this is the first time they may have done it, was a vertical, a VGUPPI analysis. And took that into consideration in doing their analysis. And I think this is the type of market where that kind of analysis may facilitate that kind of analysis. It may be a bit simpler to do than trying to do it in a digital market, for example. So ultimately, the CMA found that the merger was likely to have material price effects, either increased prices or worsened services. At either the wholesale or the retail level. So that decision is available on the CMA's website, and as I say, it's a good classic example of diversion. The second case that I looked at was the Lockheed Aerojet case that the FTC just did last year. So the FTC actually filed a complaint to block Lockheed's proposed acquisition of Aerojet, and Aerojet was a critical manufacturer of propulsion inputs that are used in producing certain defense products. And the complaint alleged that the transaction would give Lockheed the ability and the incentive to deny the supply of Aerojet's products to its rivals. And as a result, the U.S. government would pay more for its missile systems. That innovation would be lessened, quality would be reduced, and there may be impacts on national security and defense interests. What's interesting about the complaint, if you have a look at it, is there's a number of references to non-price effects that were considered by the FTC. For example, the quality of engineering support and the schedule and contracting terms for developing and supplying products. There was also consideration of the access to confidential information, and as well as consideration of the impact on future innovation. The parties ultimately abandoned the transaction after the complaint was filed. And then the third, if we have time, I'll just go quickly. The third one is the Facebook or Meta and Giphy merger in 2001 that was reviewed by the CMA. So I think we all know Facebook. Giphy supplied input to social media platforms in the form of video GIFs or GIF stickers. So the CMA's review focused on whether Meta could foreclose competitors in the social media services space by preventing their access to Giphy's GIFs. And what's important to know is that Giphy's GIFs were relied on heavily. There's only one other competitor that had even sort of similar services. The CMA looked at total import foreclosure, whether Meta would refuse to supply rival social media platforms with GIFs. And it also looked at partial foreclosure, so whether they could worsen the terms of supply of Giphy services to rivals. Whether Meta might reprioritize the innovation and development with respect to Giphy's services towards its own platforms as opposed to rival platforms. Pre-merger, Giphy wouldn't have had the same incentive to focus just on Facebook platforms in thinking about how to innovate with respect to its products. And then lastly, the CMA also considered whether making access to the content contingent on rivals providing more access to data, which is the theory of harm we talked about a bit earlier this morning. They applied the ability incentive effects framework and determined that Meta would have the ability to foreclose because of the importance of Giphy's services, of the gifts to sort of social media platforms. In terms of incentive, they found that that users would be incented to switch to Giphy's library because it was because of the quality of his library, and then and they didn't. What's interesting here too, that they didn't do any quantitative analysis. They determined, in light of the particularities of the market, a quantitative analysis wasn't feasible. And ultimately determined that the effect of the transaction would actually strengthen Facebook's or Meta's market power in the social media space. So I think those are my three. I don't know if we have time to go back to Mandy or not.
Mandy, do you want to talk about a few more cases, or do we move on?
How long do we need for questions in your closing remarks?
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
let's...
each of these mergers is significant in its own way, and it was very fruitful to learn a few details about them. In Brazil, last year, CADE has analyzed an important merger case between Redditor and SulAmérica, which unified their shareholder bases. Redditor acts in healthcare sector, operating hospitals, clinics, diagnostic laboratories, and blood banks in 11 Brazilian states and the federal district. SulAmérica has had activities in the insurance sector in Brazil since 1895. The firm offers a wide range of products and services to individuals and companies all over the country, focusing on personal protection, especially in the healthcare, dental, and financial sectors. The most relevant vertical integration found in this merger was between SulAmérica's health plans and Redditor's medical services. And the case was cleared as CADE understood the resulting horizontal and vertical integrations did not raise competition concerns. The main theories of harm related to the case were input and customer foreclosure, and also access to sensitive information between the merging parties. Okay, so now we can see if we have any questions. I don't think we have questions in the chat. If anyone wants to ask something, now it's the time. I also would like to take this opportunity to open the floor to our panelists and check if they would like to ask each other questions. No?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if everyone will manage to unmute, so maybe it's better to put the questions just in the chat.
No?
I mean,
Okay, so I have a question. Sorry?
Yeah, I just had a comment because Melissa, one of the aspects that you pointed to about the last case you talked about was, there was not really much quantitative analysis that was done. And, I think that to read decisions like that, and there are examples of that sort also in the Essilor-Luxottica, for instance, that I talked about, to read and understand and see, well, why is that? And what are shortcuts of analysis that one can take is actually quite important to understand, right? It's maybe different things in different industries, but I think, certainly if I think from the party's point of view, to do analysis to sort of can be very, very time consuming in an investigation. And I guess it will be the same resource intensive question for for reviewing agencies too. So if we find, find ways to come to places of comfort or concern, which doesn't require that, an enormous amount of analysis, those are good pathways to look at, I think. It's just a reflection.
It's a good point. And I might just add, I think as we increasingly consider non-price effects, we're going to have to become more comfortable with analysis that doesn't necessarily turn to quantitative methods, because it's crystal ball gazing, as you say, but also it's not readily quantifiable.
Mm. Yeah.
Jonas, since you talked about foreclosure, about raising rivals costs, do you see it as some kind of partial foreclosure, or would it require a different framework for analysis?
I think that, many times you think about that in the same terms, two sides of the same coin, if you like. I mean, some of the examples that we've talked about, in actual cases today, I mean, they have that dimension, and also some of the more stylized examples. But again, I mean, a question is, how do you measure the effects of that? And many times, it's been also questions about doing rather complex economic analysis. And I think someone mentioned in the beginning on the survey results that, actually maybe there are some of those tests that, simply is too much work. Maybe they're and don't give the, firm enough results for that. But maybe we should not jump too much ahead into that sphere, because I know that there are other seminars coming that deal with that topic too. But yeah, it's to find, I think, the right measures of effects that becomes very, very important.
Okay, do we have any other question? Fine, so our time is coming to an end, so I invite our panelists to make their closing remarks. Who would like to start first? Melissa, can you start?
Sure. I think in preparing for today, I realized that there are some really good resources out there. There's some really good decisions that are worth reading, and are very helpful in understanding the framework for analyzing vertical mergers, and it's really worth going back to some of those sort of textbook cases that we talked about in terms of really understanding how maybe the vanilla theory, the theory works before we get into thinking about some of these more complex theories of harm, involving data and innovation and things like that. I really think starting with the diversion cases are a really good place to start.
Jonas and Mandy?
I'm happy to jump in. I just firstly wanted to thank everyone for the time and the opportunity to present today. One of the things that struck me in preparing is not only the extent of academic literature and divergent theory, but the number of ways that every particular case can be looked at. And it also struck me that a lot of these novel theories of harm could be considered within existing frameworks, which is something that Jonas touched on earlier. We're talking a lot about new industries and digital ecosystems, but what we're really talking about is often just products, and some of the existing tools work. So sometimes it's just about reassessing how we can fit it into existing tools that we have, and it might be too soon to throw the baby out with the bathwater in some things. But thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, I would also add my thanks for allowing me to participate here, and also to the other panelists for contributing the perspectives, because I think it's a really timely project for the mergers working group to have around non-horizontal mergers. And by piling in the different experiences and helping each other to come to find the good sources, whether that is for the vanilla stuff. And I really, what you said, Melissa and Mandy, really resonated with me, that there's a lot of this that if you have a good grasp of the basic building blocks, that allows you to be effective in more complicated situations also. And those experiences, I mean, they exist in different parts of the world. And by bringing it together, and it'll be very interesting to hear the other two seminars here too, and also the results of the survey in due course, I think takes us a lot forward. So thank you for that.
Thank you. To close the webinar, first I would like to thank each of our panelists for their time and considerations. We all learned a lot today. Of course, I would also like to thank our audience for joining us today for such a special and fruitful event. Finally, I'd like to thank DigiComp and ICN for organizing this series of webinars on non-horizontal mergers. I hope you all enjoyed this webinar as much as I did, and I sincerely hope to see you all again in future opportunities. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists and to Danielle for moderating. Thank you. This was very interesting, and we're looking forward to the next webinar. I just shared the date in the chat. It will take place on the 27th of April, and we will circulate an invite soon. We're just confirming the speakers.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.